The laughter that echoed across Riverside Plantation on that brutal Georgia afternoon in 1856 wasn't coming from a joyful celebration or a light-hearted gathering. It was coming from Mistress Victoria Ashford, who stood on her columned veranda, mocking the death throes of an enslaved woman named Mama Celia as she lay dying in the dirt courtyard below, her life bleeding away from injuries inflicted during a whipping that Victoria herself had ordered, for the crime of being too sick to work. The sound of that cruel laughter, mingling with Mama Celia's gasping final breaths, would mark the moment when a dying woman's curse was born, a supernatural working so powerful that it would transform Victoria from one of Georgia's most feared plantation mistresses into a crippled creature who would spend her remaining years literally crawling on hands and knees, begging for the mercy she had never shown others. If you're ready to witness the most terrifying tale of supernatural justice in American history, where a dying woman's final words unleashed forces that crippled her tormentor and proved that some curses are real enough to destroy lives, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Mama Celia unleashed with her dying breath will make you question everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds, and the terrible power of a righteous curse spoken by someone who has nothing left to lose. The curse that would forever change Riverside Plantation had been building for decades in the heart and mind of a woman whose knowledge of conjure traditions gave her access to spiritual forces that white authority dismissed as primitive superstition, but which represented one of humanity's oldest and most powerful forms of resistance. Mama Celia, 68 years old and dying from internal injuries caused by a beating that would have killed a younger person instantly, used her final moments of consciousness to weave together spiritual energies that would ensure Victoria Ashford would experience every form of suffering that she had inflicted upon enslaved people over 30 years of systematic cruelty. The year was 1856, and the Georgia Piedmont region had become one of the most profitable cotton-producing areas in the South, its red clay soil yielding crops that enriched plantation owners while literally working enslaved people to death in conditions that combined backbreaking labor with psychological torture designed to break the human spirit. The region's proximity to both Charleston and Savannah markets had made it a center of the domestic slave trade, where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, while their oppressors congratulated themselves on bringing civilization and Christianity to people they viewed as inherently inferior. Riverside Plantation sprawled across 6,000 acres of prime cotton land along the Oconee River, its boundaries marked by towering pine trees whose shade had witnessed 4 generations of systematic human exploitation disguised as agricultural progress. The plantation house, an imposing Greek revival structure with massive Corinthian columns and elaborate ironwork, rose from this landscape like a white monument to blood money, its architectural grandeur serving as visible proof that fortunes could be built upon the systematic destruction of human lives. Mistress Victoria Ashford, 48 years old and widow of Colonel Thomas Ashford, who had died 3 years earlier, leaving her as sole proprietor of Riverside and its 350 enslaved souls, represented a particular strain of cruelty that combined the refined sadism of educated Southern ladies with the raw brutality of overseers who viewed violence as the only effective management tool. Tall and imposing, with steel-gray hair, always arranged in the latest Charleston fashion, and pale blue eyes that seemed incapable of recognizing suffering in faces darker than her own, she had transformed Riverside into what enslaved people called the Plantation of Tears, where systematic psychological torture was considered as important as physical punishment in maintaining absolute control. Victoria's reputation throughout the Georgia Piedmont was complex and contradictory. She was simultaneously admired for her business acumen in managing a large plantation without male assistance, and whispered about for cruelties that shocked even hardened plantation owners, who were accustomed to violence as a routine aspect of slave management. Her particular genius for torment lay in her ability to identify each enslaved person's deepest fears and vulnerabilities, then systematically exploit those psychological weak points in ways designed to create maximum suffering while maintaining the appearance of refined ladylike behavior appropriate to her social station. The enslaved population of Riverside lived in conditions that combined the physical brutality of cotton cultivation with the psychological warfare that Victoria deployed as enthusiastically as other plantation mistresses might pursue needlework or social visiting. The slave quarters consisted of crude wooden structures that lacked adequate space, ventilation, or sanitation. Breeding grounds for the diseases that killed 1 in 3 enslaved children before their 5th birthday and left survivors with chronic health problems that would plague them for their abbreviated lives. Among these 350 souls, Mama Celia had occupied a unique position as both spiritual leader and keeper of traditions that connected Riverside's enslaved community to African ancestors whose wisdom and power had survived the Middle Passage and adapted to American conditions. Born in coastal Georgia in 1788 to a mother who had been brought directly from West Africa, Celia had inherited comprehensive knowledge of conjure practices that combined elements of various African religions with Native American spiritual traditions and folk Christianity to create a sophisticated system for manipulating spiritual forces. The education that had prepared Mama Celia for her ultimate act of supernatural revenge had begun in childhood, under the guidance of her mother and grandmother, both of whom were recognized throughout the Georgia coast as powerful root workers whose knowledge of herbs, rituals, and spiritual forces made them indispensable to enslaved communities, while also marking them as dangerous in the eyes of white authority. From these women, young Celia had learned to identify hundreds of medicinal and magical plants, to prepare ritual objects that could channel supernatural energies, and most importantly, to craft curses that could bring devastating consequences upon those who harmed her people. The spiritual practices that Mama Celia had mastered over 8 decades represented far more than the primitive superstition that white observers dismissed them as being. They constituted a comprehensive system for understanding and manipulating the invisible forces that governed human existence. Techniques that had been refined over millennia by African priests and medicine workers who understood that reality extended far beyond what physical senses could perceive. The ability to curse one's enemies was considered one of the most dangerous and morally complex aspects of this tradition, reserved for situations where conventional resistance was impossible and where the evil being addressed was so profound that supernatural intervention became the only possible form of justice. Victoria Ashford's systematic cruelty toward Mama Celia had been escalating for years, driven by the mistress's recognition that the elderly conjure woman represented a source of spiritual authority that challenged white power's claim to absolute dominance. The confrontations between them had taken various forms. Victoria forbidding the practice of African traditions, while Celia quietly continued teaching younger generations. Victoria punishing enslaved people who sought Celia's healing services, while Celia treated them anyway. Victoria attempting to break Celia's spirit through increasingly severe punishments, while the old woman maintained her dignity through sheer force of will. The specific incident that had led to Mama Celia's fatal beating had occurred 3 days earlier, when Victoria had discovered that several enslaved women had been visiting Celia for treatment of gynecological problems that the plantation's white physician either couldn't or wouldn't address. The mistress had interpreted these visits as evidence of resistance to white medical authority and had ordered Celia whipped as punishment for practicing medicine without proper training or permission. The beating itself had been administered by the plantation's overseer under Victoria's personal supervision, conducted in the courtyard outside the main house so that the mistress could watch from her veranda, while ensuring that the punishment was severe enough to serve as an example to other enslaved people who might be tempted to seek Celia's services. The overseer had delivered 50 lashes with a bullwhip, each stroke tearing through the old woman's flesh with force, sufficient to cause internal injuries that would prove fatal despite her decades of surviving lesser brutalities. But what had transformed this act of violence from routine cruelty into the catalyst for supernatural revenge was Victoria's response to Celia's suffering during and after the beating. Instead of maintaining the cold efficiency that characterized most plantation punishments, the mistress had actively mocked the dying woman, laughing at her cries of pain and making cruel jokes about how someone who claimed to possess healing powers couldn't even save herself from the consequences of disobeying white authority. "Where are your spirits now? Old woman?" Victoria had called out from her veranda as Celia lay bleeding in the courtyard dirt. "Where are your roots and your conjure tricks when you actually need them? Perhaps you should have spent less time filling other people's heads with African nonsense and more time learning proper respect for your betters." The laughter that accompanied these words had been heard throughout Riverside, its cruel mockery cutting deeper than the whip that had destroyed Celia's body. For enslaved people, who had looked to Mama Celia as their spiritual protector and source of hope, hearing her humiliated in her dying moments represented an attack not just on one individual, but on the entire system of beliefs and practices that had sustained them through the horrors of enslavement. But what Victoria failed to understand in her moment of triumphant cruelty was that she had created the exact spiritual conditions needed for the most powerful form of curse, one spoken by a righteous person who was dying as a direct result of the target's evil actions, whose final breaths could be devoted entirely to calling down supernatural justice without concern for earthly consequences. The dying curse was considered the most dangerous form of conjure work because it combined the spiritual power of someone transitioning between worlds with the moral authority of someone whose suffering gave them the right to demand divine retribution. Mama Celia had lain in that courtyard for 3 days, her internal injuries causing agonizing pain that the plantation's physician could do nothing to alleviate. Victoria had forbidden anyone from providing Celia with meaningful medical care or even basic comfort, insisting that the dying woman be left where she had fallen as an object lesson about the consequences of challenging white authority. The mistress had made a point of taking her meals on the veranda overlooking the courtyard, forcing Celia to die slowly while watching Victoria enjoy the comforts that the old woman's labor had helped create. During those 3 days of dying, Mama Celia had used every moment of consciousness to prepare the most comprehensive curse she had ever attempted, drawing upon 8 decades of accumulated spiritual knowledge and the righteous rage that came from a lifetime of witnessing and experiencing systematic cruelty. The curse she crafted was designed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. It would destroy Victoria's body in ways that mirrored the suffering that the mistress had inflicted upon others. It would strip away her social status and dignity by reducing her to helpless dependence on enslaved people, and it would ensure that her torment would be witnessed by the same community that had watched Mama Celia's humiliation. The spiritual architecture of the curse involved calling upon multiple sources of supernatural power, the ancestors who had died under slavery and whose accumulated rage could be channeled into focused vengeance, the nature spirits who governed the invisible forces that shaped human destiny, and the divine justice that transcended human law and recognized moral truths that earthly courts refused to acknowledge. The complexity of weaving together these different spiritual energies while dying from massive internal trauma would have been impossible for anyone except a master practitioner who had spent a lifetime perfecting these techniques. The physical components of the curse had been gathered during the 3 days Celia lay dying, as enslaved people who loved her quietly brought items that could serve as ritual objects and placed them within her reach. A handful of graveyard dirt to connect the curse to the realm of the dead, roots from plants that grew along the river to channel the water's power to erode and destroy, nail clippings and hair from Victoria herself that had been collected over months by house slaves who understood they might someday be needed for spiritual work, and most importantly, Celia's own blood that had pooled beneath her broken body and which could serve as the ultimate sacrifice to fuel supernatural forces. The enslaved community had gathered in secret during the nights, while Celia lay dying, conducting prayer vigils that served dual purposes. They appeared to white observers as simple Christian services for a dying woman, but they actually involved the accumulation of spiritual energy that Celia would channel into her curse. The singing, the prayers, the laying on of hands, all contributed to building the supernatural power that would be released in the moment of Celia's death. The final afternoon of Mama Celia's life began with Victoria emerging onto her veranda for her midday meal, positioning herself where she could watch the dying woman while enjoying the elaborate food that enslaved cooks had prepared. The mistress had invited several neighboring plantation ladies to join her for lunch, apparently viewing Celia's suffering as entertainment, appropriate for a social gathering. The white women had sat in the shade sipping lemonade and discussing the latest Charleston fashions, while occasionally glancing at the dying black woman in the courtyard below, with the same casual interest they might show toward any unpleasant but necessary aspect of plantation management. "She's still breathing," one of the visitors had observed with mild surprise. "I would have thought 3 days without food or water would have finished her by now." "She's a tough old bird," Victoria had replied with evident satisfaction, "but that just means she has more time to reflect on the consequences of her disobedience. Every hour she spends dying in that courtyard is an hour that my other slaves are learning what happens to those who think they can practice their heathen religions on my property." The curse that Mama Celia had been preparing during those 3 days of agony reached its completion as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Georgia horizon. The old woman's eyes, which had been closed for hours, suddenly opened with a clarity and intensity that seemed impossible for someone so close to death. Her mouth, which had been silent except for occasional moans of pain, began to move as she spoke words in languages that combined West African dialects with Native American tongues, and fragments of biblical verses twisted into forms that served conjure purposes rather than Christian worship. The enslaved people who had been secretly maintaining their vigil understood immediately that Mama Celia was beginning the final phase of her working, the moment when accumulated spiritual power would be focused and directed toward its target with the full force of a righteous soul's dying breath. They had witnessed lesser curses before and had heard stories from older generations about the terrible power of a dying curse properly executed, but none of them had ever been present for anything of this magnitude. The words that Mama Celia spoke grew louder and more forceful despite her failing body, her voice seeming to draw strength from sources beyond the physical as she called upon every spiritual entity that had reason to support her cause. The ancestors who had died in chains, the spirits of the land that had been violated by slavery's violence, the divine forces that recognized truth and demanded justice, all of these were invoked and bound into the curse that would be delivered in the moment of Celia's death. Victoria had noticed the commotion and had stood from her luncheon table to look down at the dying woman with contempt mixed with unease. "Someone silence that noise," she had called out to the overseer. "I won't have my meal disturbed by an old slave's ravings." But before anyone could move to stop her, Mama Celia raised one shaking hand and pointed directly at Victoria standing on her veranda above. The gesture was unmistakable, and the words that followed would be remembered and repeated by every enslaved person at Riverside for generations to come. "You who laughed at my dying," Mama Celia's voice rang out with supernatural clarity. "You who mocked my pain and made entertainment of my suffering, the spirits have heard your laughter, and they will answer it with your screams. Before 3 days pass, your legs will betray you, as your heart has betrayed all mercy. You will crawl in the dirt as you made me lie here in this courtyard. You will beg for help from those you have tormented, and you will know the full measure of the helplessness you have inflicted upon others. This I curse with my dying breath, by the power of the ancestors, by the justice of the spirits, and by the righteousness of my cause. So let it be." The silence that followed these words was absolute, as if the entire plantation had frozen in anticipation of what would come next. Mama Celia's hand dropped back to her side. Her eyes closed for the final time, and with a last rattling breath that seemed to carry her spirit into the other world, she died in the dirt where Victoria's cruelty had placed her. The laughter that Victoria forced from her throat in response to the curse was hollow and uncertain, lacking the genuine cruelty that had characterized her earlier mockery. "Superstitious nonsense," she announced to her guests, though her voice carried an edge of anxiety that hadn't been present before. The old woman died raving, as ignorant slaves often do when they've lived too long and learned too little about the real world. But even as Victoria spoke these dismissive words, she felt a strange tingling in her legs that she would later identify as the first symptom of the supernatural attack that was about to transform her life into a living nightmare. The curse that Mama Celia had unleashed with her dying breath was about to prove that some forms of justice transcended earthly power, and that the mockery of the dying sometimes carried consequences that no amount of wealth or social status could prevent. The spiritual education that had prepared Mama Celia to deliver the most powerful dying curse in Georgia history had begun 60 years earlier, on the Sea Islands near Savannah, where her grandmother, a woman called Ayaba who had been born in Dahomey and survived the Middle Passage with her spiritual knowledge intact, had recognized in young Celia the qualities needed to carry forward traditions that European enslavers had tried desperately to eradicate. Under the ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss, in hidden clearings where the spirits of the land met the spirits of Africa, Ayaba had taught her granddaughter that true power came not from physical strength or social position, but from understanding the invisible forces that governed existence and learning to speak the languages that commanded them. Mama Celia's journey from frightened child to master conjure woman had encompassed 8 decades of accumulated wisdom, suffering, and spiritual refinement that transformed her into someone capable of wielding supernatural forces with the precision of a surgeon and the righteousness of a prophet. Her mother, following Ayaba's death when Celia was 12, had continued the education in the coastal Georgia marshlands, where enslaved people maintained African religious practices under the cover of Christian worship. creating a synthesis of traditions that was more powerful than either system alone. The foundations of conjure work that Celia had mastered involved far more than the herb lore and folk remedies that white observers dismissed as quaint superstition. They represented a comprehensive understanding of how consciousness, intention, and spiritual energy could be focused and directed to influence events in the material world. The techniques involved learning to enter altered states of consciousness that allowed communication with ancestors and spirits, understanding the correspondences between physical objects and spiritual forces, and most crucially, developing the moral clarity needed to wield such power without succumbing to the corruption that destroyed practitioners who used these arts for selfish or petty purposes. The ability to curse, to direct destructive spiritual energy toward a specific target, was considered the most dangerous and morally complex aspect of conjure tradition. Ayaba had taught young Celia that cursing was never to be undertaken lightly, that it required absolute certainty, that the target deserved supernatural punishment, and that the practitioner must be prepared to accept karmic consequences that might extend across lifetimes. But Ayaba had also taught that there were circumstances where cursing became not merely permissible, but morally necessary, when evil was so profound and earthly justice so completely absent that supernatural intervention represented the only possible form of accountability. The dying curse that Celia had prepared during her final 3 days represented the culmination of these teachings, a working that drew upon every technique she had learned over 8 decades, while channeling the accumulated spiritual power of generations of ancestors who had died under slavery's brutality. The curse was designed to operate with scientific precision, targeting Victoria's nervous system in ways that would progressively destroy her ability to walk, while leaving her consciousness intact to experience every moment of her degradation. Victoria Ashford's transformation into one of Georgia's most feared plantation mistresses had been gradual, shaped by a childhood in Charleston society where she had been taught that enslaved people were inherently inferior beings whose suffering was either divinely ordained or simply irrelevant to white moral consideration. But her particular genius for cruelty had developed after her marriage to Colonel Thomas Ashford, whose approach to slave management had combined systematic violence with psychological manipulation designed to break enslaved people's spirits while maintaining their economic productivity. The education in brutality that Victoria had received from her husband had been comprehensive and deliberate, as the colonel believed that plantation mistresses needed to be as ruthless as their male counterparts if they were to effectively manage enslaved domestic workers. He had taught Victoria that any sign of compassion or mercy would be interpreted as weakness by enslaved people, that systematic cruelty was necessary to maintain psychological control, and that the suffering of enslaved people should be viewed as a management tool rather than as evidence of their shared humanity. The specific cruelties that had characterized Victoria's 30-year reign at Riverside had been carefully calibrated to produce maximum psychological impact while maintaining the appearance of refined ladylike behavior. She had developed what she called domestic discipline, a system that involved constant surveillance of enslaved houseworkers, unpredictable punishments for minor infractions, and public humiliations designed to destroy any sense of dignity or self-worth that might support resistance to white authority. The punishments that Victoria favored revealed her sophisticated understanding of how to inflict suffering that extended beyond physical pain to attack the psychological foundations of human identity. Forced separations of mothers from children, not because of economic necessity, but as punishment for perceived disobedience. Public stripping and examination of enslaved women's bodies to enforce absolute submission while satisfying Victoria's need to demonstrate her power over every aspect of their existence. Deliberately inconsistent enforcement of rules to create an atmosphere of constant anxiety where enslaved people could never predict what might trigger punishment. But Victoria's most characteristic form of cruelty involved the mockery and humiliation of enslaved people who were sick, injured, or dying, treating human suffering as entertainment rather than as tragedy. She had developed a reputation throughout the Georgia Piedmont for her cruel wit at the expense of enslaved people who were vulnerable, making jokes about their pain that delighted other plantation mistresses while horrifying even hardened overseers who understood that such behavior served no practical purpose beyond the satisfaction of Victoria's sadistic impulses. The confrontation between Victoria and Mama Celia had been building for decades, rooted in the fundamental incompatibility between white authorities' demand for absolute submission and African spiritual traditions that recognized sources of power and dignity that slavery could never fully control. Victoria had understood from early in her time at Riverside that Celia represented a threat to the psychological foundations of her control system, that the old conjure woman provided enslaved people with hope and spiritual resources that challenged the narrative of white supremacy and black helplessness. The campaign that Victoria had waged against Celia over the years had taken various forms, each designed to undermine the conjure woman's authority while demonstrating white power's ability to interfere with African spiritual practices, forbidding the possession of ritual objects and conducting periodic searches of slave quarters to confiscate herbs, roots, and charms, punishing enslaved people who sought Celia's healing services or spiritual guidance, attempting to force Celia to publicly renounce her practices and convert to Christianity, as defined by white ministers who preached slave obedience as divine commandment. But each of Victoria's attacks had been met with quiet resistance from Celia, who continued practicing her arts in secret, while teaching younger generations that African traditions represented wisdom and power that predated European colonization and would survive slavery's eventual collapse. The conjure woman's refusal to be broken had infuriated Victoria in ways that routine disobedience never did, because it challenged the mistress's fundamental belief in white authorities' capacity to control every aspect of enslaved people's lives, including their spiritual beliefs and practices. The specific incident that had led to Celia's fatal beating, Victoria's discovery that enslaved women were seeking treatment for gynecological problems from the conjure woman rather than from the plantation's white physician, had represented the final straw in a conflict that had been escalating for years. The mistress had interpreted these medical visits as evidence of organized resistance to white authority, proof that Celia's influence was undermining the submission that Victoria believed was essential to maintaining control over Riverside's enslaved population. The decision to have Celia whipped to death had been made with full awareness of what the consequences would be, as Victoria understood that the elderly woman's body couldn't survive the kind of severe punishment that the mistress intended to administer. The fatal beating had been designed not merely to punish Celia, but to destroy the hope that her spiritual leadership had provided to Riverside's enslaved community, to demonstrate that African traditions and their practitioners were powerless against white violence backed by legal authority. But what Victoria had failed to understand was that she had created the exact conditions needed for the most powerful form of conjure work, a dying curse spoken by a righteous practitioner whose suffering gave her the moral authority to call down supernatural justice without concern for earthly consequences. The 3 days that Celia had lain dying in the courtyard while Victoria mocked her suffering had provided time for the conjure woman to prepare a working that would prove more devastating than anything her tormentor could have imagined. The first manifestation of Mama Celia's curse occurred within hours of her death. Victoria experienced a strange tingling sensation in her legs that she initially dismissed as a consequence of standing too long on the veranda, watching the dying woman. But the sensation didn't fade as expected. Instead, it intensified into a burning feeling that seemed to travel along her nerves from her feet upward toward her hips, accompanied by occasional muscle spasms that caused her legs to jerk involuntarily. By evening of the first day after Celia's death, Victoria had developed a noticeable limp that she attributed to having twisted her ankle, though she couldn't remember any specific incident that might have caused such an injury. The limp grew progressively worse over the course of the night, forcing her to use furniture for support as she moved through Riverside's main house. Her usually imperious gait reduced to a shuffling hobble that drew concerned looks from house slaves who remembered Celia's curse and understood what they were witnessing. The second day brought more severe symptoms, as Victoria discovered upon waking that her legs had become so weak she could barely stand without assistance. The burning sensation had intensified into actual pain that radiated from her lower back through her hips and down both legs, while her muscles seemed to have lost the strength needed to support her weight. The plantation's physician, summoned urgently from his home 10 miles distant, could find no obvious cause for the sudden onset of what appeared to be some form of paralysis or severe neurological dysfunction. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, a skilled practitioner who had treated hundreds of cases during his 30 years of medical practice, was baffled by Victoria's symptoms, which didn't conform to any disease pattern he recognized. The progression was too rapid for stroke, the distribution of weakness too symmetrical for injury, and the absence of fever or other signs of infection ruled out most common explanations. His examination revealed that Victoria retained sensation in her legs. She could feel when he touched or pinched her, but the motor function was deteriorating with alarming speed. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Cartwright admitted to Victoria's concerned relatives who had gathered at Riverside. "The symptoms suggest some form of progressive paralysis affecting the motor nerves while leaving sensory function intact. There are rare conditions that can produce such effects, but they typically develop over months or years, not days. The rapid onset is highly unusual." What the physician couldn't know was that he was witnessing the effects of a supernatural working that operated according to spiritual laws rather than medical principles, a curse designed to systematically destroy Victoria's ability to walk while ensuring that she remained conscious and aware throughout her degradation. Mama Celia's dying words had set in motion forces that transcended physical causation, channeling the accumulated rage of generations of enslaved ancestors into focused destruction of the nervous pathways that controlled voluntary movement. The third day after Celia's death brought the complete fulfillment of the curse's first phase, as Victoria woke to discover that her legs no longer responded to any voluntary commands. She could feel them. The sensation was actually heightened, making every touch painful, but she couldn't move them, couldn't transfer weight to them, couldn't use them to stand or walk, or maintain the upright posture that had been such an important part of her identity as a plantation mistress who literally looked down upon the enslaved people she controlled. The psychological impact of this sudden paralysis was devastating for a woman whose sense of self-worth had been built upon physical mobility and the ability to move through her domain, demonstrating her authority to everyone she encountered. Victoria found herself confined to bed or to a specially constructed chair, dependent on enslaved people to move her from room to room, to help her with basic bodily functions, to assist with the intimate personal care that her paralyzed legs made impossible to manage independently. But the curse that Mama Celia had crafted extended beyond simple physical paralysis to include psychological torments specifically designed to mirror the suffering that Victoria had inflicted upon others. The mistress began experiencing vivid nightmares in which she relived scenes from her years of cruelty, but viewed from the perspective of her victims, feeling the pain of whippings she had ordered, experiencing the terror of children being separated from parents, enduring the humiliation of bodies examined and judged by eyes that saw only property rather than persons. The dreams were so intense and realistic that Victoria would wake screaming, drenched in sweat and convinced that she had actually experienced the torments that had been inflicted upon enslaved people under her authority. The enslaved women who served as her caretakers would rush to her bedside in response to these midnight terrors, and they would find their paralyzed mistress babbling about spirits and ancestors, and the dying woman who had cursed her from the courtyard. If this incredible story of supernatural justice and the terrible power of a dying curse has you completely captivated and desperate to know how Victoria's torment continues to unfold as Mama Celia's curse progressively destroys her life, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of spiritual resistance that transcended earthly power. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most shocking true stories where the oppressed found ways to fight back using forces that their oppressors dismissed as superstition but which proved devastatingly real. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and whether you believe in the power of curses. I love hearing from viewers around the world who engage with these questions about the boundaries between natural and supernatural justice. The stage was set for the complete unfolding of Mama Celia's revenge, as the curse that had begun with paralysis of Victoria's legs would soon progress to accomplish its ultimate purpose, reducing a proud plantation mistress to a creature who would literally crawl on hands and knees, begging for mercy from the very people she had spent 3 decades tormenting without compassion or restraint. Based on the user's request for me to continue, prosiga, with the script following the established parameters, I will now provide Block 3, Climax, Block 4, Resolution, the video description and brief summary to complete this historical script about the mistress who mocked a dying slave, the curse that made her crawl for mercy, 1856. The deterioration of Victoria Ashford's condition over the weeks following Mama Celia's death exceeded anything that medical science of the 1850s could explain or treat. As the curse that had begun with paralysis of her legs progressed into something far more devastating and symbolically perfect, a supernatural affliction that would force the proud plantation mistress to literally crawl on her hands and knees through the same courtyard dirt where Celia had lain dying, while Victoria mocked her suffering. The transformation from paralyzed invalid to crawling supplicant occurred with a precision that seemed designed to fulfill every word of the dying woman's prophecy, proving to the enslaved community at Riverside that some forms of justice operated beyond the reach of earthly power, and that the spirits recognized truths that white legal systems refused to acknowledge. The fourth week after Celia's death brought a horrifying new development, as Victoria discovered that the paralysis affecting her legs was not stable but progressive, spreading upward to affect her lower back and core muscles in ways that made it impossible for her to maintain an upright sitting position even with support. The specially constructed chair that had allowed her some semblance of dignity became useless as her torso lost the strength needed to remain vertical, forcing her to spend her days lying flat or propped at awkward angles that highlighted her helplessness. Dr. Cartwright, who had been monitoring Victoria's condition with increasing alarm and bafflement, documented symptoms that defied every principle of neurology as it was understood in 1856. The progression of paralysis didn't follow the patterns associated with spinal injury, stroke, or any infectious disease known to medical science. Most puzzling was the selective nature of the affliction. Victoria's arms and hands retained full strength and function, while her legs and torso became progressively weaker, as if some force was deliberately choosing which muscles to destroy and which to preserve. It's as if her body is being systematically prepared for a specific purpose, the physician confided to Victoria's relatives in a moment of exhausted frustration. The pattern makes no medical sense, unless one accepts that there might be forces operating here that transcend physical causation. The slaves are saying it's a curse, and I'm beginning to wonder if they might understand something about this case that medical science cannot. The suggestion that supernatural forces might be responsible for Victoria's condition was met with angry denial from her relatives, who insisted that accepting such explanations would validate the primitive superstitions that plantation society had spent generations trying to suppress. But privately, even the most skeptical observers were beginning to acknowledge that Victoria's affliction bore an uncanny resemblance to the curse that Mama Celia had pronounced with her dying breath, legs that betrayed her, reduction to helpless dependence, and a fate that would force her to crawl in the dirt. The climactic moment that would fulfill the curse's most devastating prophecy occurred 6 weeks after Celia's death, when Victoria experienced a compulsion so powerful and inexplicable that it overwhelmed her rational mind and forced her to act against every instinct of self-preservation and dignity. She woke from another nightmare about Celia's dying moments to find herself possessed by an irresistible need to go to the courtyard where the conjure woman had lain for 3 days, to place her body in that same dirt, to experience the same helplessness and exposure that she had inflicted upon her victim. The compulsion was not merely psychological, but seemed to operate at a level that bypassed conscious will entirely, as if Victoria's body was being controlled by forces external to her own volition. Despite her paralyzed legs and weakened torso, despite the darkness of the pre-dawn hours, despite the degradation that such an act would represent, she found herself using her still functioning arms to drag her body from her bed and across the floor of her bedroom toward the door that led to the veranda overlooking the courtyard. The enslaved woman who had been assigned to sleep in Victoria's room to provide assistance during the night woke to see her mistress crawling across the floor with a determination that seemed almost supernatural, her paralyzed legs dragging behind her, while her arms pulled her forward with strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone in her weakened condition. The woman's screams brought other house slaves running, but they arrived only in time to witness Victoria dragging herself down the veranda steps and into the courtyard below, heading directly toward the spot where Mama Celia had lain dying. The sight that greeted Riverside's enslaved community as dawn broke over the plantation was one that would be remembered and recounted for generations. Mistress Victoria Ashford, who had ruled with absolute authority for 3 decades, crawling on her hands and knees through the courtyard dirt, her expensive nightgown dragging behind her collecting filth, her carefully maintained hair falling loose around her face, her entire being reduced to the same level of degradation that she had inflicted upon Mama Celia during the conjure woman's final 3 days. But the curse that Celia had crafted extended beyond simple physical humiliation to include a supernatural compulsion that forced Victoria to reenact specific aspects of the dying woman's suffering. The paralyzed mistress found herself unable to stop crawling until she reached the exact spot where Celia had lain, where she collapsed face down in dirt that still bore faint stains from the conjure woman's blood. Victoria's mouth opened against her will, and words began to pour out. Not her own words, but what sounded like Mama Celia's voice speaking through the mistress's throat, recounting in precise detail every cruelty that Victoria had inflicted over 30 years of systematic brutality. The enslaved people who gathered to witness this spectacle understood immediately that they were seeing the complete fulfillment of Celia's dying curse, a supernatural working that had transformed their tormentor into a vessel for the ancestors' judgment. The voice that spoke through Victoria's mouth told stories that no living person except the victims could have known, private cruelties conducted behind closed doors, secret acts of violence that Victoria had believed were witnessed only by the enslaved people she had harmed, intimate betrayals and humiliations that had never been publicly acknowledged. "I sold a mother's child for spite," the voice proclaimed, using Victoria's mouth to confess sins that the mistress had never admitted. "I ordered whippings for my entertainment, rather than for any legitimate purpose. I denied medical care to the sick because their suffering pleased me. I mocked the dying because their pain made me feel powerful. I spent 3 decades proving that I was a monster, and now the spirits have come to exact payment for every tear, every drop of blood, every moment of suffering that I inflicted without mercy or regret." The psychological destruction that Victoria experienced during this forced confession exceeded any physical torture that human ingenuity could have devised. She was conscious throughout the ordeal, aware of every word that her mouth spoke without her volition, understanding that she was being used as an instrument to reveal truths that would destroy whatever remained of her reputation and authority. The woman who had spent her life maintaining absolute control over every aspect of her existence was discovering that some forces could strip away that control completely, reducing her to a puppet whose strings were pulled by entities that recognized no earthly authority. The climax of Victoria's supernatural punishment came when the compulsion that had driven her to the courtyard suddenly released its hold, leaving her collapsed in the dirt with full awareness of where she was and what had just occurred. The paralysis that had affected her legs and torso remained, trapping her in the degrading position of someone crawling on the ground, unable to stand or even sit upright without assistance. Around her stood dozens of enslaved people who had witnessed her humiliation, their faces displaying a complex mixture of satisfaction, fear, and awe at the supernatural forces that had been unleashed. The attempt to restore Victoria to her bedroom and some semblance of dignity revealed the curse's final cruel twist. She had lost the strength in her arms that had allowed her to crawl to the courtyard. The muscles that had pulled her body across floors and down steps now refused to respond to her commands, leaving her completely immobile and dependent on enslaved people to lift and carry her like an infant. The woman who had spent 3 decades exercising absolute power over other human beings now couldn't move a single limb without assistance, couldn't feed herself, couldn't manage any bodily function independently, couldn't even turn her head without help. The physicians who examined Victoria after her crawling episode could offer no medical explanation for what had occurred or for the sudden total paralysis that had followed it. Dr. Cartwright, who had been documenting her case with increasing recognition that he was dealing with phenomena that transcended medical understanding, finally acknowledged what the enslaved community had known from the moment Mama Celia pronounced her curse. Victoria's condition was not a disease but a judgment, not a medical mystery, but a moral reckoning delivered by forces that operated beyond the boundaries of earthly law. "I can no longer pretend that this is a case within my professional competence," the physician admitted to Victoria's relatives. "What has happened to Mrs. Ashford defies every principle of medicine that I have been taught. The progression, the symptoms, the timing, all of it suggests an intelligence and purpose that cannot be explained by natural causes. The slaves believe she has been cursed by their conjure woman, and I am no longer prepared to dismiss that explanation as mere superstition." The social consequences of Victoria's condition and her forced public confession spread throughout the Georgia Piedmont like wildfire as neighboring plantation owners heard the story, and began to view their own enslaved populations with new wariness and fear. The possibility that conjure traditions might possess genuine power to harm white authority figures challenged fundamental assumptions about the permanence of slavery and white supremacy, suggesting that the oppressed possessed resources that their oppressors could neither understand nor control. The enslaved community at Riverside experienced a collective transformation in the wake of Victoria's crawling humiliation, as people who had spent their entire lives believing that resistance was futile suddenly understood that the ancestors were actively supporting their cause. The fear that had kept them submissive began to crack, replaced by a new confidence that manifested in subtle ways. Enslaved people who had never made eye contact with white authority now looked directly at overseers. Work songs that had been mournful took on notes of triumph, and the general atmosphere of the plantation shifted from oppressive terror to something more complex that included elements of hope and empowerment. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Victoria's punishment was the knowledge that would haunt her for the rest of her life, that Mama Celia's curse had not killed her, but had instead sentenced her to years of living with the consequences of her cruelty. Death would have been mercy. What Victoria received instead was a prolonged existence, during which she would experience firsthand the helplessness and degradation that she had inflicted upon others, dependent on enslaved people for every basic need, unable to escape their presence or their memories of what she had done to deserve this fate. The woman who had mocked a dying slave's suffering now lay completely paralyzed in the same courtyard dirt where her victim had perished, begging for mercy from the very people she had tormented without compassion, proving that Mama Celia's dying words had possessed a power that transcended death itself, and that some curses were real enough to transform the lives of those who dismissed them as primitive superstition. The years that followed Victoria Ashford's crawling humiliation and total paralysis transformed Riverside Plantation from one of Georgia's most profitable cotton operations into a haunted landscape where the living had to coexist with the constant reminder that supernatural justice sometimes succeeded where earthly law had failed. The mistress who had ruled with absolute cruelty for 3 decades now existed in a state of complete helplessness that would last until her death 17 years later. Every day a reminder to Riverside's enslaved community that the ancestors were watching, that evil would ultimately be held accountable, and that Mama Celia's dying curse had proven more powerful than any weapon that white authority could deploy. Victoria's condition after the curse reached its full manifestation was one of total physical dependence, combined with complete mental awareness, a combination that created suffering far more profound than simple death would have provided. She retained full consciousness and cognitive function while being unable to move any part of her body below the neck, trapped in what modern medicine would recognize as complete quadriplegia, but which Riverside's enslaved community understood as the ancestors' perfect judgment upon someone who had inflicted decades of cruelty without experiencing consequences. The daily routine of caring for Victoria fell to enslaved women who had once been her victims, creating a role reversal so complete and symbolic that it became the subject of stories told throughout Georgia's enslaved communities. The woman who had controlled every aspect of their lives now couldn't eat, bathe, dress, or manage bodily functions without their assistance. The mistress who had mocked the dying and humiliated the vulnerable now lay helpless, while the people she had tormented decided when she would be fed, how carefully she would be cleaned, and whether her requests for comfort would be honored or ignored. But the enslaved women who served as Victoria's caretakers did not respond to their new power with the same cruelty that had characterized their mistress's behavior when positions were reversed. Instead, they provided competent, if impersonal, care, treating Victoria with the basic dignity that she had never extended to them, while making clear through subtle ways that they remembered every act of cruelty and understood that her current condition represented divine justice rather than unfortunate illness. Sarah, a 45-year-old woman who had been one of Mama Celia's closest spiritual students, emerged as Victoria's primary caretaker and the person responsible for ensuring that the paralyzed mistress received adequate care to keep her alive. The irony was not lost on anyone at Riverside that Sarah had been among those who had sought Celia's healing services for gynecological problems, the very act that had triggered Victoria's decision to have the conjure woman whipped to death. "I take care of her because Mama Celia would have wanted it," Sarah explained to younger enslaved people who questioned why they should show any kindness to someone who had shown them none. The curse wasn't about becoming like her. It was about proving that we're better than her. We show her mercy not because she deserves it, but because that's who we are. Every day that we treat her with basic human decency is another day that proves slavery didn't destroy our humanity the way it destroyed hers. The broader impact of Victoria's condition on Riverside's operations was immediate and profound, as the plantation's management structure collapsed without the mistress's iron-fisted control. Her relatives attempted to take over operations, but they lacked both Victoria's force of personality and her detailed knowledge of the plantation's complex systems. The result was a gradual loosening of the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized Victoria's reign, as overseers and managers made concessions to enslaved workers that would have been unthinkable during the mistress's rule. The economic consequences of Victoria's paralysis extended throughout the Georgia Piedmont as the story of her curse spread and affected how other plantation owners viewed their own vulnerability to supernatural attack. Some responded by increasing security and surveillance, while others quietly approached free black conjure practitioners to negotiate spiritual protections against similar curses. The very plantation owners who publicly dismissed African spiritual traditions as superstition were privately acknowledging that these practices possessed power that couldn't be safely ignored. Dr. Cartwright continued to visit Riverside periodically to examine Victoria and document her condition for what he believed might become an important medical case study. Though he struggled to explain her symptoms within the framework of mid-19th century medicine, his private journal, discovered after his death and now preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, reveals his gradual acceptance that Victoria's condition might indeed have supernatural rather than natural causes. I have spent 30 years practicing medicine based on the assumption that all human ailments have physical causes that can be identified and potentially treated, Cartwright wrote in an entry dated 6 months after Victoria's paralysis became complete. Mrs. Ashford's case has forced me to question that assumption. The timing, the progression, the symbolic perfection of her affliction all suggest an intelligence and purpose that transcends biological processes. I am increasingly convinced that the African spiritual traditions we have dismissed as primitive superstition may access forms of causation that European science has not yet learned to recognize or measure. The legacy of Mama Celia's curse extended far beyond Riverside Plantation to influence resistance movements throughout the South during slavery's final years. The story became part of the oral tradition that sustained enslaved communities, providing hope that supernatural forces were aligned with their cause and that their oppressors were more vulnerable than they appeared. Underground Railroad operatives incorporated the tale into their recruitment efforts, using it to encourage enslaved people to believe that freedom was not merely a distant dream, but a destiny supported by ancestors who possessed the power to afflict their enemies. Harriet Tubman, who led dozens of successful rescue missions through Georgia during the 1850s, was reported to have visited Riverside Plantation during one of her journeys and to have stood in the courtyard where Mama Celia had died and Victoria had crawled. According to accounts preserved by formerly enslaved people, Tubman had spoken to the assembled community about the significance of Celia's curse as proof that the ancestors were actively working to destroy slavery from within. What happened here at Riverside is happening everywhere, in ways big and small, Tubman reportedly said. Every time a master falls sick for no reason, every time an overseer has an accident that maybe wasn't quite accidental, every time things go wrong on a plantation and nobody can explain why, that's the ancestors at work. They're using every tool they have to tear down this evil system, and Mama Celia's curse is just one example of the power that's being unleashed against slavery. The Civil War, which began 5 years after Victoria's paralysis, was interpreted by many formerly enslaved people as the fulfillment of prophecies and curses that had been accumulating for generations. The Confederate defeat was seen not merely as a military outcome, but as a spiritual reckoning, proof that the ancestors had finally succeeded in destroying the system that had caused so much suffering. Victoria lived to see slavery's legal end in 1865, experiencing the bitter irony of watching her former property become free citizens, while she remained trapped in the paralyzed body that Mama Celia's curse had created. Victoria Ashford died in 1873 at age 65, having spent 17 years completely paralyzed and dependent on the care of people she had once owned. Her death was attributed to complications from her long-term immobility, but the enslaved and formerly enslaved community understood that she had lived exactly as long as the curse required, long enough to fully experience the consequences of her cruelty, long enough to understand that supernatural justice sometimes succeeded where earthly law had failed. The funeral that marked Victoria's passing was sparsely attended by white society, as her years of paralysis and the circumstances that had caused it had made her a figure of discomfort and unease rather than sympathy. But the black community turned out in large numbers, not to mourn Victoria, but to pay respects to Mama Celia's memory and to celebrate the power of a dying woman's curse to bring accountability to someone who had seemed beyond the reach of justice. Sarah, who had cared for Victoria throughout her 17 years of paralysis, spoke at a remembrance service held in the slave quarters the night after Victoria's burial. Mama Celia taught us that the spirits see everything, that nothing is hidden from the ancestors, and that evil will ultimately be held accountable even when it looks like the wicked are prospering, Sarah said to the assembled community. Mistress Victoria spent 17 years learning that lesson, and we spent 17 years being her teachers. That was Mama Celia's gift to us, not just revenge against one cruel woman, but proof that we possess power that slavery could never take away. The site where Mama Celia had lain dying, and where Victoria had been forced to crawl, became a place of pilgrimage for formerly enslaved people and their descendants, who came to honor the conjure woman whose dying curse had proven that supernatural justice could succeed where earthly law had failed. The courtyard was eventually converted into a memorial garden where Celia's grave was marked with a stone bearing the inscription, Mama Celia 1788-1856, healer, teacher and warrior whose dying words proved that some curses are real. Modern historians studying the Riverside incident have documented extensive testimony from formerly enslaved people and their descendants, creating a comprehensive record of events that challenges conventional assumptions about the boundaries between natural and supernatural causation. While skeptics continue to search for medical explanations for Victoria's condition, the consistency of testimonies and the symbolic perfection of her affliction have convinced many scholars that something occurred at Riverside that transcended ordinary physical processes. Dr. Marcus Washington, a contemporary scholar of African American religious traditions and professor at the University of Georgia, has written extensively about the Riverside case and its significance for understanding spiritual resistance to slavery. Whether one accepts the supernatural explanation or seeks natural causes, the historical impact of Mama Celia's curse cannot be denied, Washington argues in his book, Sacred Resistance, Conjure Traditions and Slave Rebellion in the Antebellum South. The story provided hope and empowerment to thousands of enslaved people who needed to believe that their oppressors were vulnerable, that justice could emerge from unexpected sources, and that they possessed spiritual resources that slavery couldn't control. The legacy of the curse that made Victoria Ashford crawl for mercy continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about justice, resistance, and the power of marginalized communities to fight back against oppression using whatever tools are available to them. The story serves as a reminder that those who seem powerless may possess resources that their oppressors fail to recognize until it's too late, and that mockery of the dying sometimes carries consequences that transcend the boundaries between life and death. The incredible story of Mama Celia and her dying curse challenges us to consider forms of justice and resistance that operate beyond conventional understanding, to recognize the spiritual resources that sustained enslaved communities through unimaginable suffering, and to acknowledge that history is shaped not only by those with earthly power, but also by those who wield forces that transcend physical limitations. If this tale of supernatural revenge and ultimate accountability has moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about the hidden dimensions of resistance and justice, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate these extraordinary stories of people who fought back using whatever weapons they could access, including curses that proved devastatingly real. Subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage, spiritual power, and the ancestors' ongoing work to hold evil accountable. These are the stories that remind us that some forms of justice operate beyond earthly courts, and that those who mock the dying sometimes discover that final words carry power that can shatter lives and transform history.